It's important to understand the challenges in Canada. First of all, pre-K to university education is a responsibility of the state or the provinces, and the federal government is responsible for the funding of research. So every province is slightly different. So that's the first observation. The second is that for the past 20 years, there has been a shift in the ratio of funding from the provinces to students and to other sources of funding. I'll give you an example. When I first became president of the University of Ottawa in 2001, our funding coming from the state, from the province, was about 75% of our total funding. Today, I would argue that the funding at my previous institution is likely now to not been reversed, but it's probably down to about 40%, 35% is provincial funding, 40% provincial funding. For some other universities, like our large research-intensive universities, like the University of Toronto, for example, it's down to 20, 23% that comes from the province. And a lot of this has been transferred, obviously, to students, to philanthropic efforts to secure the necessary funding to deliver the services. So it is challenging. I think we're at a point now where there's very little to take away anymore. There is a challenge. Very recently in Ontario, the government decided to, as you probably read in the newspaper, to do a 10% fee rollback for the students, which was great for the students. However, the universities were not compensated for that 10% rollback. So 10%, if this had been 10% rollback back in 2001, it wouldn't have meant very much, but a 10% rollback when the fees are representing a large fraction of your revenue source, and when it's not being compensated, obviously, it affects the quality of the education. And you've got to be resourceful and find other sources of funding in order to make the difference. So I think that's an important question. I think it's important to realize also that that funding that was essentially held back had not been secured by the various organizations. And so it was not a clawback of funding, but it was a promise of funding of a previous government that essentially did not materialize. On the other hand, both the federal government and the provincial governments, both in Quebec and in Ontario, are putting major efforts in funding AI research. AI research is definitely one of the strengths that we see in Canada, across Canada, from UBC, the University of Alberta, the University of Toronto, the University of Ottawa, McGill, and Montreal, just to name, some of the key players, Waterloo also, some of the key players that are involved in AI research in Canada. And it is going to continue to be one of the major focus of the institutions, but also of the government, both the federal government and the provincial governments. We weren't monitoring this. We do have, various individuals that have told us, yes, find me a spot in Canada, or I'm applying to a CRC, and I've secured a CRC, and I'm glad I'm coming to Canada. On the other hand, we've also lost some Canadians that have gone to the UK and to the US and so on. So, it's not a statistics that we're monitoring and that we are advertising. I wouldn't know, if there was, I wouldn't know the statistics. However, the statistics that I do know is that early on in the CRC program, around 40% of our chairs were internationals, and all of the Canada Excellence Research chairs that we recruited in the various rounds were all international, and many of them were Americans and Europeans. So it has had an impact. I mean, you've heard our Prime Minister, but I think it's quite true. Canada's strength is its diversity. I mean, we bring in Canada 1 million new immigrants per year. Not 1 million, sorry, 1% of the population is essentially new immigrants per year. So we've got a population of close to 37 million. and about 370,000 to 400,000 are annual immigrants that come to Canada. And so that's very important for Canada. Yeah, it's something that we've been discussing on a regular basis. I think it's important for institutions to diversify the intake of students. Right now, China and India are the two largest countries, the two countries where we have the most international students. And there's been now, the government just announced a couple of weeks ago, an international education strategy to try to diversify the intake of students, of international students, amongst a broader base of countries. As well, the international education strategy is also very important in that we want to encourage more Canadian students to study abroad. Very few Canadian students, less than 10% of our students ever study abroad during their 4 or 5 years of undergraduate or master's studies. And so the idea is to, the government has put aside $150 million over 5 years in order to encourage more Canadian students to study abroad. And so this will also, I think, activate a mobilization of students in both directions. And the idea, to coming back to your original question of diversifying the intake, I think is very important. Yeah, I'm not sure that we've been able to immunize ourselves. We do have populist movement in Canada. I mean, if you follow the federal election right now, there is the PPC, which is a populist movement in Canada. It has very little traction. Some might say that some provincial governments that have been elected, they've been elected on conservative platforms, which is very different from necessarily populist movements. But there is, I think universities have got to be careful. We've got to demonstrate value. We all have seen the results of the Pew survey in the US, where the perception of Americans vis-a-vis university varies tremendously, number one, between the Republicans and the Democrats. I don't think that we're at that level in Canada, but I think there is an opportunity for Canadian universities to demonstrate their contribution to society, their value. We always talk about the value of research-intensive universities to the public and making sure that people understand the contributions that we're making. And we always say that we're not part of the problem, we're part of the solution. It's an investment that people are making in universities and investments that are paying dividends. I mean, Canada is known for its high quality of life. I mean, in the U.S. News ranking, Canada ranks number 1 or number 2 in terms of quality of life. And why do we do research? It's to improve the quality of life of our citizens. And so in that sense, I think the message needs to be reinforced because of the pressures that you've mentioned at the beginning in terms of funding. I think people need to feel reassured that investing in research, investing in public education, because all universities in Canada are public in contrast to our neighboring country. But that's a challenge that we have to demonstrate value all the time.